Hello, 7th graders. This is Mr. Shear, and today we're looking at life on the Oregon Trail. And you've got a choice today. You can do one of two things. You can either continue watching this video and complete this Edpuzzle, or you can come to the Google Meet, where I'll do the same slideshow live. I'll throw in a few extra videos, etc. at the Google Meet. But if you come to the Google Meet, you do not have to continue this Edpuzzle. So again, you can either watch this Edpuzzle and complete it, or come to the Google Meet, but you don't have to do both. All right, just as a reminder, we're doing the Oregon Trail for 3 days. Yesterday you did a brief overview of the landmarks on the trail. Today we're going to talk specifically about life along the Oregon Trail. And then tomorrow we're going to talk about one ill-fated group, the Donner Party, where everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and it results in cannibalism. So that's tomorrow's topic. All right, but today we're doing life on the Oregon Trail. So here's the Oregon Trail. It left from Independence, Missouri, and ended in Oregon City, Oregon. Now I'd like to point out two things. One, it's not an exact trail. In some places the trail varied by about a mile, especially in these grassland sections. In other places like Wyoming, the trail varied by about 100 miles. There's all kinds of shortcuts. This was a general consensus trail. This is the way that most people went. Also, the Oregon Trail launched into the Mormon Trail, going down to Utah, the Santa Fe Trail, cutting through Nevada, going to California. A lot of people started on the Oregon Trail, but they didn't necessarily go all the way to Oregon City. They'd break off and go to other places. So quick overview of some facts from the trail. First off, the trail was about 2,170 miles long. It was in full operation from about 1836 to 1869. What ended the Oregon Trail was the emergence of railroads in the 1870s. The year of the Great Migration was 1843. That's when the most people traveled on the trail. So the trail was its most popular in the 1840s. Again, it went from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon. About 400,000 people traveled along the trail throughout the 30 years that it was operating. 20,000 people died along the trail, most of whom were buried along the trail. And if you ever go to sections of the Oregon Trail today, and there's still bodies buried in those areas. They weren't all buried in graveyards. Only about 400 people died due to Indian attacks. So Indian attacks, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that's not a huge part of the pioneer experience. And again, not one exact path. It's more of a route. So this Edpuzzle looks at life on the trail in 3 categories. First, we're going to look at reasons for coming out west, why people made this trip. 2, we're going to look at the hardships along the trail. And lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about daily life along the trail. So let's just jump in. All right, section 1, reasons for coming out west. Well, the first reason was, for a lot of people, and these are in no particular order, but a big reason people came out west was religion. So many of the pioneers traveling west wanted religious freedom. The most famous of these groups was the Mormons. And I know we have some students that are Mormons. Some of you guys watching might be Mormon. But Mormonism is an American religion that was founded in 1830. So by 1836, it's brand new. And the Mormons moved around to several different states out east, feeling persecuted. Joseph Smith, the founder, is killed violently. And eventually, seeking their own haven and their own country, over 60,000 Mormons used the trail to move out west to Utah. And I like this picture because the Mormons were famous for hand trucks. A lot of them carried their own materials and supplies. And it wasn't just Mormons coming out west. All kinds of religious groups came out. They're just the most famous example. All right. The second thing, which is the craziest thing to me, was the free land giveaways that were being offered in the Oregon Territory and out west. So between 1850 and 1860, there's various policies, the two most famous of which are the Homestead Act of 1862 and the Land Claim Act of 1850, which gave settlers free land. You would receive about 640 acres of free land if you were a married couple. And depending on which act you took advantage of, where you settled, if you were a single individual, you could get 160 to 320 acres of land given to you for making the trip out west. Most of these acts had stipulations that you had to build a home on the land and you had to live there at least 4 or 5 years. Now, again, depending on the year, depending on where you settled, how much exact land you got, but this is the largest land giveaway in United States history. And it brought a lot of people west. All right, some people came for the simple reason of adventure. It's exciting to be out west. Outdoorsmen and outdoor women were captivated by the beautiful air and the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. A lot of fur trappers, once the fur industry dried up in the 1830s, wanted to continue their life of adventure, so they got hired as guides along the trail. But it was a thrilling place to be out in the Pacific Northwest. Lots of animal, lots of game, lots of outdoor adventures to be had, bears, etc. And I think a lot of people just traveled west simply for the adventure of it all. Reason number 4, business opportunity. So many people felt like there was an opportunity to start new businesses in the ever-expanding boom towns of the Pacific Northwest. So as towns got established, you could start a grocery, you could start a supply store, you could start a mill, you could start a cannery, but there was a ton of opportunity. Even if you're a lawyer or a clerk, there's all kinds of opportunity to create your own business. And for a lot of people who came from poverty in the East, they saw the West as their opportunity to have their own business and to thrive. And for many, they did. What you're looking at on this picture is an early picture from Seattle. Doc Maynard was one of the most famous pioneers to come out west, and his store still exists in Pioneer Square in Seattle. He had a supply shop. All right, reason number 5. Yeah, a lot of people moved because their families moved, and that might sound silly, but if you think about it, if you're really close with your sister or your brother and they say they're going out west, well, there's no phones in the 1840s, there's no internet in the 1840s, there's no mail system out here initially. You will probably never see or potentially hear from that person again. So when one group decided to move, they were often brought along in-laws, parents, brothers, sisters, uncles, loved ones. A lot of people moved out west because their families moved out west. And of course, children and teenagers had no choice in the matter, and they often came out west because, of course, mom and dad were relocating the family. So they became pioneers. And the last reason we talk about for the reason to move out west was to escape slavery. The Civil War happens in the 1860s. So the Oregon Trail, again, is most popular 10 to 20 years before the Civil War, which means that slavery is still legal in the South in the United States. And for a lot of African Americans, tensions are growing. A war is about to break out over the issue of slavery and the horrors of slavery. And for a lot of African Americans, moving out west meant peace. It meant you could have opportunity. It meant you could be in a territory without slavery. And it meant that you could start a life without the fear of war. So a lot of people moved out west to avoid all the issues associated with slavery. And that included soldiers, too, and Caucasian white soldiers who didn't want to fight in the upcoming war. All right, we're going to jump to topic number 2, hardships along the Oregon Trail. All right, so the biggest killer on the trail was disease. Dysentery was common, but especially cholera. And cholera is gross. Cholera is a bacteria that can survive and live in water. And what it does is it dehydrates you, and it affects your stomach to the point where you can't hold liquid. And that liquid then is going to come out, this is gross, either through your mouth or the other end. And it would often lead to diarrhea and vomiting. Now, if you are sick with cholera, it is fast acting and it can kill you within a couple hours. So you can wake up in the morning, feel fine, be afflicted with cholera, and you could be dead by sundown. Now, for a lot of people, this meant fevers, again, vomiting, again, diarrhea. And when people have emergency bathroom issues, they often wander off to get away from the trail because nobody wants to do that publicly. And they would often go by the rivers. They'd go by the water. They'd go behind a bush, which would be close enough to the water that it would get back into the water, and the bacteria would live in the rivers, specifically the Platte River, which traveled much of the first third of the trail. And of course, travelers coming out back then didn't sanitize their water. We didn't have an understanding of bacteria or disease, and people would drink their water straight from the Platte River, and they would get more cholera. And ironically, because people were dehydrated, often what was given to people with cholera while they're dying would be more cholera water. But cholera by far was the biggest killer along the trail. Second major hardship would be drowning and river crossing in general. Probably the biggest river you had to cross was near Topeka, Kansas, the Kansas River in the state of Kansas. And this was especially difficult because you had to carry your whole carriage through the water. Most carriages could float a little bit, and as well as your animals who could get spooked. And if there's fast currents, if there's logs coming, there was all kinds of accidents happening during river crossings. If you had enough money, you could pay a ferryman to take you across on a little makeshift ferry boat, and that was the safest way to cross the river, but even that could have accidents. So drownings were not uncommon, and really, again, if a horse gets spooked crossing up to its head in water, it can kick, it can buck, and there was all kinds of issues with crossing rivers, specifically the Kansas River. All right, accidents in general happened especially on hills. So the average prairie schooner, the average wagon, weighs about 1,300 pounds, and then the average amount of supplies was about 2,000 pounds. So going down hills, you can imagine, was especially treacherous, especially through the Rocky Mountains. Rocks, bumps, all kinds of issues that could happen, but if somebody lost control of their wagon, there is several journal entries about people breaking legs, people getting crushed to death, and again, there's no hospitals, so a broken leg could mean death along the Oregon Trail, and accidents happened frequently. Money is a hardship. It wouldn't so much get you killed, but it could, especially because there's con men and robbers everywhere, especially in the big camps. So Independence Rock is, you might have noticed it on maps, but it's a giant rock where about halfway through the trail represents the halfway point. A lot of people would camp at Independence Rock and carve their names into the rock. You can see the carved names today. So think of it as graffiti along the Oregon Trail. Well, that also meant that there was a lot of con men in Independence Rock and a lot of camp robbers. So if you had a lot of money, if you flashed your money around, people would try to take it from you. They'd try to gamble it away from you. Also, if you didn't bring enough money, then you were doing more dangerous things like crossing rivers without taking the ferry. So a lot of pioneers did not budget correctly and didn't realize how many river crossings they'd have to pay for, how much a guide would cost, and over time, they ended up running out of money, and that could lead to a lot of dangerous actions along the trail. And lastly, there were Native American attacks. Again, these are minimal, and the reason I bring it up is because movies, video games, popular media has made Native American attacks very, very common. You see it in movies, etc. Often the wagons would circle up, and the Indians would be trying to break through the circle and attacking pioneers. This was a very, very rare occurrence, but over the 30-some years, about 400 pioneers did die from Native American attacks. Now, that's not to say the Native Americans didn't love stealing or conning silly pioneers out of their supplies as they traveled across the West in some cases, but in many cases, Native Americans were helpful. In many cases, most cases, Native Americans were curious. And if anything, the Native Americans felt like their land was being threatened. Most of their animals hunted. A lot of the plant life that they relied on being eaten by oxen, and they were frustrated, if not peaceful. So, life on the trail, our third topic. So just some general facts about getting ready. The most common animal that people would use along the Oregon Trail was oxen. Oxen are big, strong, and dumb, which makes them well trainable, whereas horses have a lot more personality. Horses are also not as strong as oxen, and they require more food because they put off more energy. Oxen are big, slow, and easy to control, so most people used oxen. The other benefit of oxen is buffalo chips. You can imagine with thousands of people all heading on the same path, firewood could become very hard to find. And so mostly what the pioneers would burn at night for their campfires and to stay warm was buffalo dung, which they call buffalo chips. But these are giant cow pies that burned pretty clean. And in some countries today, like Nepal, that's still what a lot of families use for their heat source. However, if you could think of an animal, it was probably on the Oregon Trail. There's cases of camels pulling prairies. There's, of course, donkeys, which are ornery. There's cases of unicycles on the Oregon Trail. The bicycle's brand new. Some people in the later years tried riding their bike along the Oregon Trail. If you could think of it, people tried it. One of the most famous kind of novelty acts, though, was seeing a camel along the trail. All right, the second thing before you leave is you need your supplies. The average family would bring at least 2,000 pounds of supplies, packing for a good 6 months. The average trail time was 4 months, but it was good to be prepared, so lots of flour, hundreds of pounds of lard, which is fat, salt and pepper, beans. You need guns for hunting. Of course, you'd have some personal items. Bacon, if you think about it, you can't bring meat because nobody has coolers or refrigeration doesn't exist at this time. So dried meat, specifically bacon, was the most common protein that people would bring. And there's famous stories of people just dumping their supplies because most or many pioneers overpacked. So just outside of Independence, Missouri, you would see all kinds of furniture just dumped. Cast iron stoves, dressers, people's china, fancy dishes would just be dumped along the Oregon Trail. And by the 1850s, much of the Oregon Trail just had, I don't want to say garbage, but supplies lining pretty much the whole trip. So what a lot of ambitious people would do is those folks living in Independence, Missouri would just wait for the pioneers to dump supplies, and then they'd bring it back to Independence. They'd sell that big cast iron stove to the next pioneer who would buy it and then dump it, and then they'd go pick it up again and sell it back to the next pioneer. One of the most famous stories is there's a group of wagon trainers who famously left 20,000 pounds of Bacon outside of Fort Laramie. And to give you a general timeline of when you would leave, you didn't want to leave too early in the spring, so most people left in April, and the reason you didn't want to leave too early was the grass hadn't grown yet, and you wanted good prairie grass to feed your animals. So if you left in February, if it was a nice February and you felt like you could make it, you might be able to leave weather-wise, but often you would encounter not enough prairie grass to feed your animals. So you wanted spring, specifically the heart of spring, which is April, and the average trip took 4 months. So that would get you there by the end of July, sometimes in August. However, it could take up to 6 months depending on how your river crossings went, how fast you walked. But you didn't want to leave too late. If you left by July, then you're getting to the Rocky Mountains right in time for snow, which is what happens to the Donner Party, who we'll talk about tomorrow. So the perfect time to leave would be about April or May. Now, life on the trail itself is actually for many quite boring. Most pioneers do not ride in covered wagons. The wagons were full of stuff. 2,000 pounds is a lot for an oxen to drag, plus the wagon itself, like I said, weighs 1,300 pounds. So you're talking about an ox having to drag 3,500 pounds. Most people did not ride in wagons. Most of the pioneers walked, and walking, the average distance was about 15 miles per day from sunup to sundown. And really, with 400,000 people traveling, the experiences of each pioneer and each day-to-day journey really vary. So some pioneers had a very swift, uneventful trip. Other pioneers had run-ins with Native Americans, or they were robbed in camp, or a wagon wheel broke, or one of their family members died. And the journals that have been left indicate that there's a great variety in the experiences people had, but most of them walked. Again, this is 2,100 miles. Most people walked 10 to 15 miles a day, and many of the journals talk about how just how boring this would get. So we're going to take a look here at a couple journals. I just wanted to show you this. This is the journals of James and Nancy Kuhn, who started out in April of 1847, and their journal kind of cracks me up. It makes me chuckle. Again, I want to keep in mind, if you're hiking all day, a lot of the journal entries are short. People only got maybe an hour of daylight at night. You're sitting around your, oxen dung campfire. You don't have much daylight. You're tired. You're not writing much. But their journals, this is a series of their entries. A calf gave out, weather pleasant. That's all they wrote that day. Went to Henry Creek. They're not sure. All night. Pleasant. Went to James Dills by 11 o'clock. Pleasant. Left James Dills. Rain. Pleasant, pleasant, pleasant. It just cracks me up. Again, you get the sense from some of these journals. Crossed a Grand River. Pleasant. 13 miles. Just kind of the monotony of what a lot of these people felt as you read through some of these journals. And we'll finish this with this one journal entry that was not monotonous. Was the journal of Henry Garrison. And Henry is a young man. He's 14 years old when his family sets out. And his journals, if you were to ever look through them, really show a family that had a series of adventures. It also shows how teenagers felt about being on this trip. It's not their choice necessarily to go. It's their parents are bringing them out here. They're leaving their friends and their world behind. A lot of this stuff is new and without context. But Henry, in this particular entry that I'm going to show you, Henry's 7-year-old brother, Enoch, had his leg crushed by a wagon in an accident. And they tried to amputate the leg, meaning cut it off, but the 7-year-old bled too much and died. And in his journal, Henry discusses this. Of course, he's devastated. Of course, he's sad. But he talks about the logistical burial of his brother Enoch here. It was reported that the Indians was in the habit of opening graves for the purpose of getting shrouding. To prevent this, the grave was dug in such a place that the wagons, when leaving camp, might pass over it. In digging the grave, those who have it in charge was careful to cut and lift the sod in squares so that they could be replaced when the grave was filled. What he's talking about is he has to bury, this is a true journal entry, his family had to bury his 7-year-old brother, and they didn't want Native Americans grave robbing his grave, digging him up. So they carefully cut away the grass into square pieces, dug the 7-year-old's grave, put him in it, and then carefully put the grass back over it and ran their wagons over it to make it look worn so that nobody would be able to tell that there was somebody buried there. And when it says habit of getting shrouding, that often means even for a 7-year-old, he would have been buried in his best clothes. Henry's journals are fascinating, but I'm just going to read you his last entry, which says, Our journey is ended. Our toils are over, but I have not tried to portray the terrible conditions we were placed in. No tongue can tell, nor pen describe, the heart-rending scenes through which we passed. So their journey is quite the adventure if you ever look through Henry Garrison's journals. And there's hundreds of these journals in historical archives now. So, okay, we're going to end with this. So you finally get to Oregon City or somewhere in Oregon, and then people just dispersed. And kind of as a fun fact, I'll tell you that most of the forts in Oregon, including the one in Oregon City, were run by the Hudson Bay Company, who you might remember was British. It was a fur trapping company. And the British were still very much hoping to claim Washington at least, and British Columbia, which they will claim, but to claim all this area north of the Columbia River. So most of the people that came to Oregon on the Oregon Trail were directed by Hudson Bay Company officials to settle south of the Columbia River. So less came to Washington, more stayed in Oregon, many went to California, Northern California, but the Hudson Bay Company would say, hey, yeah, you don't want to go north of the river. They discouraged people, saying that north of the Columbia River was not good farmland and that people should stay in Oregon. All right, 7th graders. Thanks for watching the video. Again, if you've watched this video, it's going to be the same information at the meet, so you can do one or the other. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, as always, for watching.